It's dawn. You're in a small coastal village in England, year 845 AD. You wake up to screaming. By the time you reach your door, it's already too late. Longships line the beach. Vikings are everywhere. Your village is burning. You run, but they're faster. Within minutes, you're on the ground, a boot on your neck, iron chains around your wrists. Your life, as you knew it, is over. Welcome to the Viking slave trade. And what happens next is far worse than death. For over 300 years, Vikings didn't just raid for gold and silver. They raided for the most valuable commodity in medieval Europe, human beings. The word they used was Thrall. It meant slave. Property, less than human, and the archaeological evidence shows this wasn't rare. It was industrial scale. Mass graves across Scandinavia reveal the truth. DNA analysis from Iceland shows that 80% of founding females were Celtic or British, taken by force from their homelands. They didn't migrate, they were captured. Genetic studies from 2020 analysing Viking Age remains found something chilling. A significant portion of the Scandinavian population had recent ancestry from the British Isles and Eastern Europe. These weren't traders or willing immigrants, these were the descendants of slaves. This wasn't just war, it was systematic human trafficking that built the Viking economy. The numbers are staggering. Historians estimate that during the peak of Viking expansion, between 10 to 20% of Scandinavia's population were thralls. In a society of maybe 2 million people, that's 200,000 to 400,000 human beings living in bondage. And unlike Roman slavery, which had paths to freedom, Viking thraldom was hereditary. Your children were born slaves, their children were born slaves, forever. So what really happened when Vikings captured you? Let's follow the journey, step by brutal step, based on historical accounts, archaeological evidence, and the few written records that survived. And I warn you, this gets very dark. The moment you're captured, you're stripped of everything. Your clothes, your possessions, your identity. Vikings work fast. They're not here to occupy, they're here to extract value and leave. You're herded with other captives to a collection point. Women are separated from men. Children are ripped from their parents' arms. The Vikings know that separated families are less likely to resist or escape. Iron collars go around your neck. Chains connect you to 20, 30, sometimes 50 other prisoners in a long human chain. This is deliberate. If one person tries to escape, everyone pays the price. Then comes the march to the longships. If you're inland, this could mean days or weeks of walking, chained, with minimal food and water. The weak fall behind. The Vikings don't slow down. Those who can't keep up are killed on the spot or left to die. Archaeological evidence from mass graves along known Viking routes shows bodies with shackle marks on their wrists and ankles, killed during transport. When you finally reach the coast, you see them, the longships, sleek, beautiful, and absolutely terrifying. You're loaded into the hull, not the open deck where the warriors row, the dark, cramped cargo hold below, packed in with dozens of other captives. There's barely room to sit. The smell is overwhelming. Human waste, vomit, death. The voyage is hell, chained in the hull of a Viking longship. For days, sometimes weeks, depending on the destination. No bathroom facilities. You soil yourself. Everyone does. Disease spreads fast in these conditions. The food is minimal. Stale bread, dried fish if you're lucky. Just enough to keep you alive. Water is rationed. People die. Dysentery, dehydration, infection, despair. Their bodies are unchained and thrown overboard like garbage. No ceremony, no prayer, just disposal. An Arab traveller named Ibrahim al-Tartushi visited the Viking port of Hedeby around 950 AD. He described what he saw. Never before have I heard uglier songs than those of the Vikings. The growling sound coming from their throats reminds me of dogs howling, only more untamed. He was describing the sounds from the slave holds, the groaning, the crying, the prayers for death. If you survive, and many don't, you eventually arrive at your destination, the Longship docks. Light floods into the hold for the first time in days or weeks. You're pulled up onto the deck, blinking, barely able to stand. Welcome to the slave market. The Viking slave trade had 3 major hubs and one ultimate destination that made Vikings incredibly wealthy. First, Dublin, Ireland. Founded by Vikings in 841 AD, it became the largest slave trading centre in Western Europe. Archaeological excavations in the 1970s uncovered the Woodkey site, revealing structures specifically designed for holding slaves. Chains, shackles, pens built to contain human cargo. Irish annals from the period are filled with references to slave raids. The annals of Ulster record that in 821 AD, Ytre was plundered by the heathens and they carried off a great number of captives. Great number of captives appears again and again in these records. Historians estimate that Dublin's slave market processed tens of thousands of people during the Viking Age. Second, York, England, renamed Jorvik by the Vikings after they conquered it in 866 AD. This wasn't just a military conquest, it was a business decision. York became a major trading hub connecting Scandinavia with the rest of Europe, and slaves were a primary commodity. Third, Hedeby in modern-day Denmark, right on the border with Germany. This was the gateway to continental Europe and the Baltic. Archaeological digs have revealed slave quarters, trading posts, and evidence of a massive commercial operation, but all of these markets had one ultimate destination that paid the highest prices: Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire, the richest civilization in Europe at the time, had an insatiable demand for slaves. They needed labourers, soldiers, servants, and eunuchs for the imperial court. Vikings discovered they could make a fortune by transporting slaves down the river routes of Eastern Europe, through what is now Russia and Ukraine, all the way to the Black Sea, and then to Constantinople. This route was so profitable that Vikings established permanent settlements along the way. These Norse traders, called the Rus, are literally the origin of the name Russia. An Arab diplomat named Ahmad ibn Fadlan travelled this route in 921 AD and left us one of the most detailed eyewitness accounts of the Viking slave trade. He wrote, "They arrived from their distant lands and lay their ships alongside the banks of the river. There they trade in sable, squirrel, and ermine furs, and in slaves." Slaves listed right alongside animal pelts. Just another product. So how does the market actually work? You're taken to a holding pen, still chained. Now you're cleaned up slightly because you need to look presentable enough to sell. Vikings are practical. A filthy, sick-looking slave sells for less. Then comes the inspection. You're brought to a platform or open area. Buyers circle you like your livestock, because to them, you are. They check your teeth to assess your age and health. Rotten teeth, lower price. They examine your hands. Calluses mean you're used to labour. That's valuable. Soft hands mean you're educated or highborn, which could be valuable for ransom or domestic work. They check your body for scars, injuries, signs of disease. Any defect lowers your price. Women are inspected for childbearing potential. Young women fetch premium prices. Children are evaluated for trainability, young enough to forget their former lives and be moulded into compliant slaves. The prices were recorded in multiple sources. A healthy adult male slave could sell for 8 to 12 cows, a massive sum. That's equivalent to years of average income for a free farmer. A young woman could sell for even more, sometimes 15 cows or higher, depending on appearance and skills. Children sold for less up front but were seen as long-term investments since they'd provide decades of labour. The payment usually came in silver, which Vikings weighed carefully. They'd cut coins into pieces to get exact weights. Archaeologists call these hack silver, and they're found in huge quantities in Scandinavia, evidence of this massive trade. But here's what the history books often sanitize or skip entirely: what happened after you were sold. Because being purchased wasn't the end of your nightmare, it was just the beginning. Life as a Viking thrall was permanent slavery, no contract, no term limit, no hope of earning freedom through service. You belonged to your owner until you died, and your children belonged to them too. The archaeological evidence paints a brutal picture that legal texts alone can't convey. Skeletons identified as thralls through burial practices, they're buried in unmarked graves, often without goods, sometimes without ceremony, show signs of severe malnutrition even in wealthy households. Their bones reveal they were fed just enough calories to work but nothing more. Bone analysis reveals repetitive stress injuries from constant manual labour, spinal compression, fractures from carrying heavy loads, joint deterioration from repetitive motions, healed broken bones that set incorrectly because thralls didn't receive medical care, bodies worn out by their 20s and 30s. Some skeletons show evidence of violent trauma, blunt force injuries to the skull, cuts from blades. These are the thralls who were beaten or killed by their masters. Legal codes from the Viking Age, written down in Iceland and Norway centuries later, but reflecting older oral traditions, spell out exactly what thralls could and couldn't do. A thrall could not own property of any kind. Everything you produced belonged to your master. A thrall could not testify in court. If your master killed someone and you witnessed it, your testimony was worthless. A thrall could not carry weapons. Even a simple knife for work had to be surrendered at day's end. A thrall could not refuse any order from their master. Any order. And I mean any. They could be beaten, maimed or killed with essentially no legal consequences. There were some laws suggesting fines for killing another person's thrall, but only because you damaged someone else's property, like breaking their ox. Your daily life depended entirely on your master and what skills you had. Farm thralls, the majority, worked from before sunrise to after sunset, ploughing fields with primitive tools, tending animals in all weather, hauling timber from forests, building structures, fences, walls, digging ditches. The back-breaking work that free Vikings didn't want to do. They slept in the worst quarters, often just a corner of a barn or outbuilding, sometimes not even that. In winter, they might sleep with the animals for warmth. Domestic thralls, usually women, had it differently but no better, cooking every meal for the household, cleaning, spinning wool and weaving cloth for hours every day, making clothes, brewing beer, raising their master's children while their own were taken away or worked elsewhere. And then there was the sexual exploitation. Let's be direct about this because the evidence is clear. Female thralls had no right to refuse sexual advances from their masters or anyone else in the household. This was understood and accepted in Viking society. The sagas mention it casually, as a normal part of household life. Children born from these relationships were sometimes recognised by their fathers and given some status, but often they were just more thralls, more property. The genetic evidence confirms this was widespread. DNA studies show extensive mixing between Scandinavian males and Celtic and Slavic females during the Viking Age, but the pattern is overwhelmingly one-directional. Viking men fathering children with captive women. Some thralls had specialised skills that gave them slightly better treatment. A thrall who could smith iron, work leather, or had medical knowledge might be valued enough to receive better food and housing. But they were still property. The psychological torture was perhaps worse than the physical. You're constantly reminded that you're less than human. You can't look free people in the eye. You speak only when spoken to. You have no name that matters. You're just thrall, or sometimes given a nickname that's intentionally degrading. One legal text specifies that if a free person kills a thrall, even accidentally, the punishment is minimal, but if a thrall strikes a free person, even in self-defense, the penalty is death, or severe mutilation. There are recorded punishments for disobedient thralls: branding, whipping, having an ear or finger cut off as a permanent mark, hamstringing, cutting the tendons in the legs so you can't run but can still work on your knees, and if you tried to escape, the punishment was death, often public and brutal to serve as a warning to other thralls. But some did try. Archaeological evidence from bog bodies, well-preserved human remains found in Scandinavian peat bogs, shows several individuals who were likely escaped thralls. They were caught, executed, and thrown into bogs. Some show signs of torture before death. The complete lack of hope is what made Viking slavery particularly cruel. You weren't serving a prison sentence. There was no redemption, no path to earning freedom through good behaviour or buying yourself out. You were born a thrall, you would die a thrall, and your children would be thralls forever. unless something even darker happened to you first. There's a reason Viking thralls disappear from the archaeological record at certain sites, and the explanation is horrifying: human sacrifice. When a wealthy Viking died, they didn't go to the afterlife alone. They took their possessions, their ships, their animals, and their thralls with them. The most detailed account comes from that same Arab diplomat, Hamad ibn Fadlan, who witnessed a Viking chieftain's funeral in 922 AD. I'm going to read you his account, and I warn you, this is disturbing. He describes how, when a great man died, they asked his thralls, "Who among you will die with him?" One of the slave girls volunteers, possibly coerced, possibly seeing death as escape. For the days leading up to the funeral, she's treated well, given good food, allowed to drink heavily, she's dressed in fine clothes, and she's repeatedly raped by the men of the tribe, each one telling her, "Tell your master I did this out of love for him." On the day of the funeral, she's led through a ritual, lifted up 3 times to see into the afterlife. Then she's taken into the dead chieftain's ship, which has been prepared as a funeral pyre. Inside the tent, an old woman they call the Angel of Death is waiting. The girl is given more alcohol until she's barely conscious. Then she's strangled with a cord, while multiple men hold her down and simultaneously stabbed repeatedly. The ship is set on fire and the entire scene burns. The chieftain travels to the afterlife with his slave. Ibn Fadlan was traumatized by what he witnessed. He wrote, "The practices of these people are like those of dogs. They are the filthiest of God's creatures." For a long time, historians debated whether Ibn Fadlan's account was exaggerated or misunderstood. Maybe he was just a prejudiced outsider, misinterpreting Viking customs. Then archaeology confirmed he was telling the truth. The Oseberg ship burial in Norway, excavated in 1904, contained 2 women. One was clearly high status, buried with incredible wealth. The other showed signs of trauma consistent with ritual sacrifice. She was likely a thrall killed to accompany her mistress. Multiple other Viking Age burials show similar patterns: high-status individuals buried with other humans who show signs of violent death, positioned as servants, no grave goods of their own. In some cases, thralls were decapitated and buried at the feet of their masters. But human sacrifice wasn't just for funerals, it happened at temples too. The temple at Uppsala in Sweden, described by Adam of Bremen in the 11th century, conducted sacrifices every 9 years. 9 males of every creature were sacrificed, including humans. The bodies were hung in a sacred grove near the temple, and Adam wrote, "The sacrifice is of this nature. Of every living thing that is male, they offer 9 heads. With the blood of these, it is customary to appease the gods. The bodies are hung in the sacred grove." Who were these male sacrificers? Likely a mix of criminals, prisoners of war and thralls. Humans with no social protection. Archaeological excavations at Uppsala and other temple sites have found human remains consistent with ritual killing, strangulation, blunt force trauma, multiple individuals in the same location. But there's an even darker economic reality to Viking slavery that we need to address: castration. The Byzantine Empire and Islamic caliphates paid premium prices for eunuchs to serve in royal courts and harems. Castrated slaves couldn't produce heirs and were seen as more trustworthy around royal women. Vikings, ever the opportunists, began castrating some male thralls, particularly young boys, specifically for this market. The procedure had a high mortality rate, maybe 50% or higher, with Viking Age medical techniques, but the survivors were worth many times the price of a normal slave. This is documented in multiple Arabic sources describing trade with the Rus Vikings. They refer to Sakaliba, Slavic slaves, many of whom were castrated before being sold south. The Hudud al-Alam, a 10th century Persian geography text, specifically states, "The Vikings, among their commodities are slaves, both male and female, and eunuchs." Archaeological evidence is harder to find for obvious reasons, but the written records from multiple sources, Norse sagas mention it obliquely, Arabic sources describe it explicitly, leave little doubt this was happening. And then there's the simple murder of thralls for practical reasons. If a household fell on hard times and couldn't feed all its thralls, they were killed. Excess population control. If a thrall became too old or injured to work effectively, they were killed. No retirement, no care. Some sagas mention thralls being killed simply because their master was angry or drunk, This was so common it barely warranted mention in the texts. The absolute dehumanization is what makes Viking slavery particularly dark. These weren't even considered tragic deaths, they were just disposing of property. So was there any escape? Any hope? The honest answer is very little. Some thralls did earn their freedom, but it was extremely rare. A few sagas mention thralls being freed in their master's will, though this was more common in Christian areas influenced by the church's teachings. Some high-value skilled thralls might accumulate enough wealth, despite technically being unable to own property, to buy their freedom. But this was exceptional. Escape was nearly impossible. Where would you go? Scandinavia is surrounded by water. If you're a foreign captive, you don't speak the language, don't know the land, and you're marked as different by your appearance or accent. Even if you made it to a ship, where are you sailing? The distances were enormous, and if you were caught, the punishment was death or worse. Some thralls did escape during the chaos of battles or raids. Some melted into populations of other escaped slaves and outcasts on the fringes of society. A few, very few, made it home. There are rare accounts in Irish and English sources of people returning years after being captured, forever changed by their experiences. The slave trade began to decline in the 11th century for several reasons. Christianity spread through Scandinavia, and the church opposed the enslavement of Christians. This didn't stop all slavery, but it reduced the supply as Viking raids on Christian lands decreased. The Viking Age itself was ending. Scandinavians were settling down, forming kingdoms, integrating into European feudal systems. Raiding became less profitable and more politically complicated, and paradoxically, as Scandinavia became wealthier through trade, they became targets for raids themselves. The threat went both ways. By the 12th century, thraldom as an institution was fading, replaced by serfdom, which was still brutal but legally different. The last references to thralls in legal codes date to the 1200s, but the genetic and cultural legacy remains. As we mentioned earlier, DNA analysis shows that the majority of Iceland's founding female population was Celtic, taken from Ireland and Scotland. The modern Icelandic population carries this legacy in their genes. Cities like Dublin, York, and Kiev owe their very existence to Viking activity, including the slave trade. And perhaps most importantly, this history matters because it's often romanticised. We see Vikings in popular culture as noble warriors, explorers, and traders. They were all those things, but they were also slavers on an industrial scale. They built their wealth and expansion on the forced labour and broken lives of hundreds of thousands of human beings. The ships, the raids, the settlements, the trade routes, all of it was funded and made possible by slavery. Understanding this doesn't diminish Viking achievements in navigation, craftsmanship, or military tactics. It contextualizes them. It makes them human, capable of great innovation and great cruelty. History isn't simple. The Vikings weren't just heroes or villains. They were people operating in a brutal world with brutal practices that we find unacceptable today. But we need to remember what really happened to the people whose names we don't know, who died in the holds of longships or in the slave markets of Dublin, or working themselves to death on Scandinavian farms, or as sacrifices in rituals to gods they didn't believe in. They were real, they suffered, and their story deserves to be told.